Welcome, everyone. Tonight is the second in a series of programs called the League of Women Voter Empowering You, a program designed by the League of Women Voters in partnership with Dayton Access TV to provide unbiased, nonpartisan information on issues that are relevant to our friends and neighbors throughout the greater Dayton area. I'm David Bodary, a member of the League of Women Voters, and your host for this evening as we discuss tonight's topic, the 2019 election. Our guests this evening are Tom Roberts, former elected official from Dayton to the Ohio General Assembly in both the House and the Senate at various times, and now currently the president of the Ohio Conference of the National Association. I got it wrong, the NAACP. Thank you. And then second, Jan Kelly, who is our director of Montgomery County Board of Elections. And finally, Lucianne McKosky, editor of the League of Women Voter Guide. So thank you all for being here tonight.
Thank you for having us.
You're welcome.
So Tom, let's get started. Historically, in an off-year election, voters' turnout is much lower, sometimes maybe between 30 or 40%. Right. Why do you think that is, and what should we do about it?
Well, I think it's primarily because the hype that there's this thing called off-year election. And when I was running, and I still do, say there's no such thing as an off-year election. You know, the individuals we'll be voting on this year are local elected officials, the school boards, the city commission, the council, the mayor, and township trustees. This is where all politics is local. And so the decisions that these elected officials make affect our day-to-day life, our trash collection, our fire, police, hospital. So I think every election is critical. I don't see anything called an off-year election, but I think media always says it, so people believe it. But for me, all politics is local, and those individuals running this year are just as important as the candidates running in the nationwide and statewide elections.
That's a really good point. We think of it off-year, but really it's a mid-year, between the presidential election years, right?
Yeah.
And of course there are things that happen mid-year elections that don't happen at other times as well.
Right. And see, for me, I think even saying that, it puts so much emphasis on the national, when for me it's every year. And so we ought to talk about how important it is for people to be engaged and elected officials, regardless of what year, odd year, even year, whatever it is. Because again, part of voting is giving our rights to somebody else to make decisions on the most important issues of our lives. So we ought to treat it that way, right, and treat it as one of the most important rights, responsibilities we have as citizens. For me, every year is an election year. Every year we ought to be looking at those candidates and holding their feet to the fire before we cast that ballot.
Appreciate that.
Yeah.
I think often about how we ought to describe ourselves as voters, not voting. Not something I do once,
right,
but something I do regularly.
Exactly.
So that's really what I hear you describing. Yeah. Are there implications for people that sit out this midterm election year from your perspective?
I think so. From the point of view, you limit yourself, but you also let a smaller number of people, in some cases 20% of the voters, but you let a small group of people make major decisions for you. And this is why groups like the League of Women Voters, NAACP, are so important, because our job is not to be partisan, but encourage voters to turn out and vote. Turn out and vote, because that is the most important, treasure we have as citizens. So for me, yes, if you don't participate, then fewer people are electing the most important people that run our lives. So we have to think of them that way. And sometimes I think the candidates turn people off. And you look at all this nasty throwing of stuff back and forth, and a voter will say, I don't know who's right, and still stays home. That's why, again, the league and groups like NAACP and others have to help clean up and say to voters, here's what they're really talking about, and help people understand why important is so important.
Sure, I appreciate that. Jan, as it relates to what you see from the county perspective, can you help us get a sense of how these midterm elections have differed? Do you have any sense of historically how that's played out?
Well, if we look at the 2015 general election, which is a good analysis to view, there was about a 41% turnout in most jurisdictions. Why is that? That was a high turnout, actually, for an election of this nature, and that was because we had 3 state issues on the ballot. We had marijuana, which failed at the time. We had the constitutional reform for redistricting, which passed, and we also had the monopoly issue where one person couldn't, make a monopoly out of, I think it was for marijuana issues. So those 3 state issues, I think, drove a lot of interest to the polls. But I agree with Mr. Roberts. We're prepared 100% for 100% of the voters to come out. We really want to see people come out. We've made it easy with our new voting system. It hasn't been easier for people to vote. I mean, we have absentee voting, we have early voting, we have vote at your polls, vote at your kitchen table. There's really no excuse for people not to vote other than apathy, or they're just fed up, or they just are not cued in.
Right. I think apathy is what I sense from the classroom work that I do. Students are sort of just tired of the bickering, and yet, Tom, your point is we can't allow ourselves to be apathetic about it. We need to engage, so I appreciate that. But now tell me more about these new voting machines, because you mentioned that, but there's much more to understand as it relates to what's happening there.
Yeah, today we had an open house at the Board of Elections to showcase. We spent $8 million. We had funding from the state of Ohio as well as from the Montgomery County Commissioners, and the Board of Elections actually had saved money every year, and the county did allow us to put it into a special fund, so we had those monies as well. So we looked for about 2 years. It was a big research project. We went all around the country and had vendors come to us to pick what we thought was the safest, most secure, and adaptable type election equipment to serve the voters of Montgomery County that they could feel safe with, and that was easy to use, and was easy to use not only for the voters but for the thousands of precinct election officials that we count on every year to run our elections at 153 different locations throughout the county.
Wow, so that's a huge operation
It
to
is.
begin with, and then of course the importance of the security of that
Yes,
operation.
yes.
And it's all done in that 1 or 2 day, right? I mean,
Right.
other than the voting that's going on at the county building itself.
Exactly,
So then that's just the second Tuesday of November.
exactly.
So, all right, that's a huge investment.
It is.
What is it that you really are hoping that this investment will ensure?
Well,
for our community?
the old system worked, but it was starting to break down. It was similar to a 15-year-old phone, basically. I think the BlackBerry probably was
And
a
how
good
many
example.
of us have a 15-year-old phone?
And the data that we retrieved from the machines, there were over 2,500 different PCMIA cards that you had to take out of the machines and bring back to the Board of Elections, which we had to download.
Right.
And just a dry run took about 2.5 hours just to download those cards. So we're hoping that with the media being just in 2 media sticks and the scanners, we're reducing that significantly. So we'll just have 2 scanners at each location, which will each voter will submit their digital ballot or their manual ballot in those scanners, so it'll reduce the amount of media we have to download, so we'll be able to get results to the media, to the Secretary of State's office, and to the public quicker. Also, it's much easier to use. You're not going to hear that click, 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 that thing on the side, the
Right.
verifiable paper
Dot
audit
matrix
trail.
printer.
Yeah, that was an aftermarket thought by the state. I don't know if you were in the State House then.
Yeah,
It was.
it was.
It was
Yeah.
kind of a last-minute thing that they had to add, so the vendor came up with this VPAT, and it's kind of like an old sewing machine. It would run on a thing, and you hear this click, 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 and people want to open it, and yeah.
Right.
So you don't have that anymore, and basically it's an old-fashioned method. I mean, you're going back to paper, and you have a screen, an express vote that's similar to what the TSXs were, where you're digitally marking your ballot.
Okay.
But the neat thing is everybody gets their ballot in their hand. We found everybody wanted to touch their
To
ballot.
feel it.
Yeah, they didn't like kind of a machine taking it, like where is it going? So now they can see it goes right into the scanner, and they're casting their own ballot. And it also tells a voter if they've overvoted a race, if there's a marginal mark on it, or there's something that the scanner can't read. It gives the voter an opportunity to either get a new ballot or to correct something on that
Okay.
ballot so that it's readable.
So I visited the Board of Elections today.
Yeah.
And I experienced just what you've described. In fact, I got my ballot. I was able to then put it into the machine. I marked my choices. And in this instance, it was kind of just pretend.
Right.
There were 2, I could choose up to 2. Well, I wrote in a candidate that I wanted. It was, I think, a favorite thing to do or something. But it was just for fun.
Right.
But it identified that I hadn't chosen 2, and did I want to? So that was really helpful because it ensured that we were clear that my vote was truly voting the way I had wanted. And I was able to look at it and say, oh yeah, that's correct.
Right.
And then I could put it into what is now sort of a ballot box, I guess?
We're calling it, it's the scanner. Yeah, you'll sign in, you'll select how you want to vote, whether you want to vote digitally or you want to vote manually, which is a paper ballot, and then you submit both into the scanner. Get
Right.
your I voted today sticker and you're out the door.
Right. And so let's take a minute to think about the security, because I'm sure part of this investment was trying to address the security concerns that we've had in past elections.
Right. Cybersecurity is a hot topic. This Secretary of State, Frank LaRose, has issued an extensive directive that all the boards of elections are following and have to follow by January 20th of 2020. We are working with the Department of Homeland Security, ESA, which is the election infrastructure agencies, the Ohio State Patrol, and other agencies and entities. So it's a nice group of interagencies on a federal, state, and local level that are all working together and bringing their talents to the table to help if anything should occur. So we have a much better interaction with these entities. In case something happens, we have a much better connection with emergency numbers. There's lots of surveys that have been filled out, and a survey, I mean, that we're sharing information. Who do I contact in case of?
Okay.
We didn't have that before. We never had that interagency working. So we've really got a good connection, and we also are very aware of what might happen. And it is occurring. I mean, people are trying to hack into everything these days. You hear it every day. Target,
Right.
some of the biggies. So it's happened in different states. I think Dallas, the city of Dallas just had a big ransomware attack. So we're doing everything that we are aware of that we can within our power to stop them.
That didn't happen when you were first elected, did it, Tom?
But I think we're just being cautious, because I don't think it's happening. As people think of cyber, they think of dipping into the voting machine and getting material out. That's not what's happening.
Correct.
I think most of the counties that have had issues have been human error, and it's been with the Board of Elections. But I think, by and large, I think the voting process has gone off just great across the state, and it's all been human error. And the tape was an idea. Representative Jacobson was on the committee too, and we looked at when you go to the ATM machine, you get a receipt that shows how much. But the thought was then, but we don't want you to take that and go outside and pay and get paid for voting. So that's why we stayed in a secure box. People wanted to see who they voted for, and if who they voted for was going to show up on the machine, but it was being stayed secure because the fear that maybe now you take it outside and get someone to pay you for voting.
You're thinking about everything.
Yeah, that was the conversation we put that in there.
Interesting.
Because I remember the ATM conversation came up, and we said, Senator Feder and I were for it, and the other members were okay, but let's put some securities there.
That's interesting. Some inside baseball there.
Yeah.
So what I was impressed by today is the way in which the digital system had the paper backup, because I had my ballot, right? It printed out. I got to move it from my hands then into, what do you call it again? The scanner. And the scanner then would basically store that data on the little USB drive.
Right.
But then it also has the physical paper that I put into the machine there in the box.
Right. It goes into a drop box. We call it the blue ballot box. And so there's always a backup in elections. There's always Plan A, and we always have Plan B. And that's a good thing, because if something happens and that USB stick is compromised, our backup is lost, and the internal backup of the backup is not working, then we have the paper ballot as another backup.
And no hanging chads.
That's it.
And plus, the one
right.
thing that really keeps us cyber secure is we're not connected to the internet in any way.
I was going to ask about that.
Other states, for example, Florida, in some fashion has a connection to the internet because they can transmit their data instantaneously from the polling location to their Secretary of State. We are not allowed to do that. We are not allowed by state law under the Ohio Revised Code in any way to be connected to the internet.
So these machines are not somehow software connected, Wi-Fi connected, or any other way connected to any intranet or internet or any of those things?
No, the only thing that is connected is at the polling locations. We have the electronic poll pads. They're just like a fancy iPad.
Yeah.
And they have we download all the voter registration data history for every registered voter in the state is on each of those poll pads. And we have an iSync, if viewers are familiar with that, and that communicates with the next poll pad so that you can't come in and vote at this iPad and then go over and vote at this one. So that's another safety mechanism for double voting.
Sure.
So that stops that. But no, nothing's connected because everything's stored on a USB port.
Yeah, well, thank you. And there's plenty to talk about, but I wanted to give Lucienne a chance to talk about the good work that you've been doing and tell us where are we in terms of the voter guide and what can you share?
Well, the voter's guide is hot off the presses. Printed yesterday, delivered today. If people who live in Greene County may receive it with their suburban newspapers this week, if you take the Dayton Daily News, it'll be in your paper next week. You can also pick them up at the League office at 127 North Ludlow between 9 a.m. and 2 p.m. any weekday. You should also be able to find them by the end of the week at your local library. This year, for the first time, we're making a concerted effort to deliver them to all of the senior living facilities in the county, in the two-county area. And they're available at other locations. If you want to pick them up and take them to your school or your church or your neighborhood center, come to the League office and pick them up.
Great.
That's 127 North Ludlow Street between 9 a.m. and 2 p.m.
Yeah, that's so helpful.
Can you deliver some to the Board of Elections? Because we always have people asking for them when they come to vote.
I'm sure we can.
Okay, great, thank you.
It is so useful, and certainly my work at Sinclair, the faculty, the staff, the students all recognize it, and they're asking me, when is it going to be available? I really need that and use that to make my decisions. So let's take a minute to talk about what does it take to create the guide, what are the kinds of steps in the process, and what kind of time investment is there?
It takes probably several hundred hours over a period of a couple of months. We usually start working in July when the boards of elections start posting preliminary candidate lists. We know at least what races are going to be on the ballot, and we have an idea of how many candidates there are going to be. So we develop questions that are appropriate for the different races. For instance, this year we had city commission and city council races, township races. We had some areas that have been severely impacted by the tornadoes this year, so we had some very specific questions for some of those jurisdictions, whereas those questions weren't relevant to some of the other areas in the county. So we make up a questionnaire for each race. We send them out to all of the candidates for contested races. Because of the large number of candidates, we're not able to cover the uncontested races, which are the ones where there are only as many candidates as there are available seats. For instance, if there are 3 seats on a school board and 3 candidates running, all of those candidates will be elected and that race is uncontested. Right. Therefore, voters don't have to make decisions about which ones to vote for. But if a race is contested, then each candidate gets a questionnaire distributed either by mail or by email, and they have the opportunity to respond. All candidates in contested races are invited. Not all respond.
I was going to ask that. So not everybody that you invite would necessarily respond. And so then do we leave a blank spot if they don't respond? What happens?
We indicate no reply.
Okay.
We did find this year that there were some technical issues in communicating with candidates. There were some who did not receive their questionnaires and others who submitted responses that never reached the office. This is the first time really we've had much problem in this area. So if a candidate is indicated as having not replied, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're not interested.
Right.
It
Gotta be
may
careful.
mean
Yeah.
that something happened that was, through no fault of theirs or ours, there was a gap in communications.
So how many candidates are we looking at in Montgomery County this election?
A lot. 225 candidates are on the ballot.
So 225, and there's a few that maybe we had some miscommunication with. But I'm just still thinking about the percentage then of contested seats that we've got content for that'll be available in the league guide. Yeah, so
Yes.
most of them you've got information
Yes.
for.
We
Good.
had 55 contested races with 175 candidates.
Wow. Plenty of work to do.
Yes.
And this voter guide is in English only. We were talking
Yes.
earlier, though, about how during the presidential election years, we like to try to make it available also in Spanish.
That's true. And we hope to do that in even-numbered years when there are statewide races
Sure.
and more interest, general interest in the election.
Well, for sure. Yeah.
So, yes, so we definitely plan to do it in Spanish next year.
Okay. Good.
Yes.
Are there any issues on the ballot this year? And if not, what else might we look for or find on the ballot?
There are no statewide issues this year. However, there are many local issues, including city, township, and school district tax issues. Also, several cities have charter amendments on the ballot for voters to consider.
Sure.
And they are all listed in the voter's guide. Although we don't give detailed information, we do show what issues will be on the ballot for each city or township or school district. And if voters want more information, they can contact the finance director or treasurer for the local entity.
Sure. Whether that be the city or the township or
Right.
whatever.
David, one of the unique aspects of the League of Voters Guide is nonpartisan. Generally, when as a candidate, I probably get 5 to 10, questionnaires to be put in a particular document, but they're asking you from their point of view, what you think about their issue on this, that, or the other. And I always point people to League of Voters Guide because it's nonpartisan. It just, as you point out, it asks you some specific questions. You answer that question, but you get to see from the candidates from a nonpartisan point of view. It's a good guide to have as voters go to the polls and vote.
Absolutely.
And we try to ask open-ended questions, not looking for particular answers, but questions on which candidates may have differing positions so that voters can get a good idea of where candidates differ in their views.
Right.
Because it is nonpartisan, has no advertising in it at all, voters can take it to their polling place.
Right.
So you can study the guide, choose your candidates, mark them in your voter's guide,
Okay.
take it to the polls, and then use that as a reference to remember which candidates you liked the best.
I see what you're saying. So you're saying because this isn't marketing material from a candidate or
Correct.
from a party, we can take that with us into the polling station.
That's correct, yes.
Right. You can even take marketing material or
If I
information.
choose.
They call them the palm card or slate card.
Okay.
You can take them in. They call them the palm card because they used to fit just in your
In your
palm. They were
palm,
smaller.
okay.
But yeah, voters, they take them in all the time. We just ask them to take it back out with you.
Right, not to leave it
When
behind.
you leave. But Lucy, you reminded me, when I was 18 at the University of Miami in Coral Gables, I was a student helper with the League of Women Voters there for one of their candidate forums.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, I just remember that.
Yes. The league also presents candidate
Right.
forums
Oh, yeah.
around the county
Yeah.
and giving voters an opportunity to interact face-to-face with candidates.
So I have a question, and this is a question that I get a lot of times from students because sometimes the candidates for various positions are pretty clearly a Democrat or Republican. It's pretty easy to identify. but then sometimes the judges are less easy, and the students are like, how do I find out about a judge? Where do I turn for information about the judges? Any advice for my students who have those kinds of questions?
Judges are an interesting case because they run on the primary, on a partisan ballot in the primary, but a nonpartisan ballot in the general election. We do cover contested judicial races.
Okay, so there will be some information.
Yes. This year there is only one contested municipal court judgeship on the ballot.
Interesting. Okay.
In even-numbered years, there are apt to be Court of Common Pleas judges, Court of Appeals judges, and Supreme Court judges. There is also a website called judicialvotescount.org that sends questionnaires to all of the judicial candidates statewide, and so that's also a good place to look for information on judicial candidates.
For so long, David, because of the code of conduct, or code of something,
Ethics,
ethics,
yes.
Code of ethics.
candidates for judicial races say we can't answer that. But the league and groups like NAACP have found ways to ask that question. You know, it would be, if you could belong to an organization, what organization would you belong to? Or because they can't answer questions as it relates to cases that might come before them.
Sure.
So you ask them other questions like that. So it's important for voters to know where the judges stand without really asking them how they will come down a particular case.
Sure. Right.
So you can find the site that Lucy's talking about as a good reference site to go to.
That's really helpful.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. You're just a wealth of knowledge.
Yes.
That's great.
Or if I can take my Board of Elections hat off for a second, you can call either the Democrat or Republican headquarters as
Right.
the main parties and see what candidates, if you're voting, straight party ticket, who the Republican or Democrat candidate is.
And that would give you who they're endorsing.
Right.
Who they're
Is that right?
endorsing, because when you
Yes.
get to the polls, and when I first moved here, I remember going into the polls and going, oh,
Yeah.
are you kidding me? I don't know whether they're a Republican or Democrat. And because in Florida, they run partisan.
I see.
They run nonpartisan, but they're listed as partisan on the ballot. But here in Ohio, they run partisan, but are not listed as a partisan affiliation on the ballot.
On the ballot. Okay.
Different laws, different states.
Right.
Yes, that's an important point, that nearly all the local elections are nonpartisan. However, some candidates have been endorsed by the Republican or Democratic Party. So if you're interested in the endorsed candidates for a race on your ballot, call the party headquarters of your choice and they can tell you.
That's really helpful. So I'm thinking about so many questions that I have, but one, you brought up being at Coral Gables, the University of Miami,
Right.
right? So I have a daughter in Tennessee,
Ah.
and she is obviously still wants to vote. She's still registered to vote here in Montgomery County, but what are her options given that she's away?
That's one of the big questions that parents call and ask us. I just had a girlfriend from Oakwood call me and ask me. She can request an absentee ballot. Unfortunately, and I say unfortunately because I think in this day and age, everything should be available electronically, just like you can register to vote online now. You should be able to register to request an absentee ballot, and hopefully there's some legislation that's in the works to make that happen. So this year, the Secretary of State will not be mailing out an absentee ballot to every registered voters as they have in the past.
Okay.
The law provided that the Secretary of State would be allowed to mail out to every registered voter in even years if the budget so allows. So
Okay.
since this is an odd year, you wouldn't even be concerned about the budget for that. Everyone will have to request an absentee ballot. So your daughter at the University of Tennessee, okay, great. She can just go online. It is online, but she has to fill it out, download it, and send in snail mail
Okay.
because we have to verify her signature to make sure that's actually her requesting it.
Okay.
And then once we receive that, we'll check all the information and make sure she fills out everything. And it's all yellow highlighted, the
Okay.
important areas, and then we'll mail her absentee ballot to her at the University of Tennessee.
Good.
And then she has to mail it back to us.
Okay. Now, fortunately, and this question leads into the next one, she has a fall break coming up next week.
Right.
So if she's home, could she walk in and vote at the county building
Sure,
next
sure.
week?
We open for early voting today.
Okay.
So we're open 8 to 5 for the next few weeks. The last weekend of the early voting is the weekend before the election, and we have extended Saturday and Sunday hours, and you can check on our website at mcboe.org for those hours, or the Secretary of State's website has a nice voters toolkit where you can check your registration status, your precinct location, and information about voting hours.
So that website is mcboe.org, and then to check if my precinct would be.
You can check right on our website as well.
The same
where
website,
there's
okay.
an icon that says "Where's my polling location?" Just
Okay.
click on it, and it'll give you directions as
Right.
well.
Right. The voter's guide also includes information on early voting
Oh,
great.
and absentee voting.
So you've got directions or specific dates and times that
Yes.
can help clarify those
Great,
things.
great.
Yes. If you're thinking about voting absentee, people need to realize you have to send your application in time to get the ballot back.
Right.
So that you can mail the ballot back. It has to be postmarked, what, by the day before
The day before the
day?
election, right, right.
Yes.
So that this time would be November
5th.
5th?
Yeah, so it
Fifth,
has to be
okay.
postmarked November 4th and received by our office within 10 days.
Okay.
As long as it's postmarked with a valid postmark, which is a U.S. mail, not a Pitney Bowes or some other office thing that is not controlled by the U.S. Postal
Right. So
Service.
the timing of it is
Yes.
secure. Got it.
Since now sometimes mail doesn't get postmarked, is it better, with all the automatic equipment in the post office, is it better to take it to the counter in the post office and ask to have it date stamped?
I would. It's your vote.
Yes.
Yeah, it matters. Sure. Okay, but then that
David-
leads. Go ahead, Tom.
Well, I want Jen to explain, because it's a trick, because sometimes people ask for the absentee ballot, then show up at the polls on election day.
Right.
And they don't remember they did it. So they then have to vote provisional ballot.
Right,
That's
right.
the case, yeah.
I was going to ask the same
Okay.
question. So
Yeah.
yeah, I would love it if you could explain how this works.
Yeah, sometimes people, especially the elderly, might forget that they requested an absentee ballot. They could have called into the office and said, I want an absentee ballot application, and think that's the whole thing, they're done. So we mark it, and we've sent them an absentee ballot application,
Sure.
and then an absentee ballot, and they forget they got it, and it gets thrown away. Or they might not want to vote that way. They decided, you know what, I don't think I want to go to the polls.
My daughter's going to go downtown. I'll go with her.
Yeah,
and it works
so when
out
they
easier.
go to the
That's right.
polls, in the poll pad, it'll say absentee next to it. So we'll say, we sent you an application, and they'll say, yeah, I did get it.
Can't find
But
it.
I want to vote today. So we'll vote what's called a provisional ballot, and it's provisional on the fact that we have to check and see if, in fact, they do have an absentee ballot that they did vote and send in to us. And we check that back at the office. It's a lengthy process, but we go through every single ballot. And during presidentials, we'll get up to about 13,000 provisional ballots.
Wow.
But every provisional ballot that can be counted is counted. And most of the reasons provisional ballots are not counted is because the voter was not registered. However, by virtue of them filling out the provisional envelope, they are then registered for the next election.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So it automates
Yes.
that process.
Yes.
Well, that leads me to another question that relates to this business of automating our voter registration process.
right.
And Tom, you have a little bit of information about
Well,
that.
NAACP has been pushing for this for a long time, going back to our national convention. I think early it's 2015, but 2017 for sure. And it's called Automated Voter Registration, or AVR. And the Secretary of State has introduced, or had someone introduce legislation this year. And David, when people go to sign up for welfare or public relief, they're given a bunch of applications, and among those would be your voter registration.
Okay.
And 99% of times, because we've had conversations, it was done right and they signed it and everything. Well, now what the Secretary of State is working on, when you go to renew your driver's license and to update your driver's license, let's say you've moved or you've changed names, that information automatically, when you go to the Bureau of Motor Vehicles, will be transferred to the boards of election. And that will deal with some of this issue of purging from the rolls. People have moved and the information will go directly from the Bureau of Motor Vehicles to the Board of Election, and my information will be changed. it's called AVR, or automatic voter registration.
And if I understand right, this is happening in other states already.
I think 17 other states already have it. And Ohio has done this, but not to this degree.
Okay.
And the Secretary of State is saying, let's start with the Bureau of Motor Vehicles,
Okay.
then we'll move to other agencies and state government agencies. So I would think in the next 4 years, you should be able to go to many state agencies and automatically have this done. But I think he's thinking that most people have driver's license or some form of ID, and this is probably the most efficient way to get this job done right now.
Sure. So does that mean if I'm going to renew my tags on my license, would that also be a trigger to ensure that I had it all updated?
If you've moved or
Any of
changed your
those
name,
things.
and it should be, whenever you have this interaction with the Bureau of Motor
With
Vehicles, that's when it should happen.
Okay.
Yeah, that's basically, yeah.
Right,
Yeah.
right. And we like it because the information is more accurate and it's quicker for us to process. I mean, when you have to go through paper, any kind of paper process is just arcane these days. And it's a good way to get more people. There's more people, I don't know if there's more people registering to vote because the numbers tend to go up and down depending on the election. But it certainly does make it easier for the voter to register to vote. And then they have a choice with the, I think with the AVR program, whether they want to register or not. It's not necessarily automatic. They can opt out.
And this
If
is
they
something
choose.
that League of Women Voters, NAACP, and Ohio Voices, and Common Cause, so many statewide groups are pushing for. So right now we're in education mode, so people know the bill is pending, but the idea, the concept has arrived in Ohio.
So it sounds to me like it would take advantage of some of the technology that allows us to become more efficient, right? Do it once in an electronic format, and theoretically then we could then transfer that information to the other entities that might need it. Is there any downside to it? I mean,
No,
can't imagine.
at least from the Bureau of Motor Vehicle, there's not a downside. The other ones, there can only be a downside if it's not pushed in a, I'm not sure if it's opt-in or opt-out. Let's say if you're given the paperwork and not asked to sign it, you know, because with the Bureau of Motor Vehicle, it's automatically done. With these other agencies, I think you have a choice to decide if you want to fill out the applications or not. And so that's why I like what we're doing now. And maybe as the Secretary of State's office gets more proficient at this, the other agencies will be able to do it just as the Bureau of Motor Vehicles does it efficiently.
right, well, that's good.
I think that's a very good way of keeping people's registration updated when they move or change their name, because they may not realize that they need to do this, and then there's the rude shock of finding they're not registered to vote.
Yeah.
Well, and I think the stress of moving is also one of those times in our lives where we've got so much on our minds. We've got all the balls in the air, or
Right.
the plates on the stick, right? And you're just so busy. And that's one of those things that you could just slip your mind.
Or the other one would be a divorce, change of name, you know,
Yes.
so that's such a stressful situation. You never think, well, changing my voting information. So, I mean, that's another example where this would be very efficient.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's where I guess machines could actually help us,
Yeah.
as opposed to sometimes I feel like the machines are not helping us.
Yeah.
But in this case, maybe the machines could help us.
And maybe no junk mail with it.
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Wouldn't that be something?
You know, Jan, when you were talking earlier about security, I was wondering about how you protect the security of the voter registration rolls.
Oh,
Right. Well, we have backups in our office, and we have backups off-site, so we're protected there.
So what would you do if hacking were detected into the voter registration system?
That I probably won't discuss on TV.
But you have,
We have protocols in place for that,
Yes.
correct.
good.
right.
Good question though, Lucy, yeah.
So we've talked about college students.
Yeah.
We've talked about this automated voter registration process. But let's take a minute and think about the person who's ready to come and vote. And maybe they're going to come downtown to the county building during this period of open election. But what do they need to bring with them? How do we make sure that when they arrive, they have what is needed in order to cast their ballot?
They need some kind of ID, not necessarily a photo ID. They can bring a photo ID, a state ID, a military ID. Even if the military ID doesn't have an address on it, that's acceptable. A government-issued ID, a CCW, You can bring anything, check from your workplace. You could bring your Sinclair work check if you still get that, but most people don't get those now. We're direct deposit. So some of these laws and things that were made up years ago, and being a legislator,
For the utility bills,
it takes all utility
Okay.
bills. Another one, as long as it's issued within 12 months and has your name and your address on it, that's acceptable.
So utility could mean my cable
Cable
utility,
bill,
my
yeah.
phone bill?
Your phone bill, but you can't show it to us on a phone. It has to
Okay,
be
right.
a paper copy.
And this is where we're in that in-between
Right.
world, right? Where especially children my daughter's ages, I have a 28 and an 18-year-old,
Yeah.
they live in a different world than I live
Right.
in. And so they might think about, oh, I'll just show them this. And no, it doesn't work that way. So it's got to be something that was mailed to my home.
Right.
Okay.
Right. I know when my kids graduated a few years ago from high school, they were like, said you have to register to vote. Well, how what do you mean? Like I have to, like they couldn't believe they had to fill out a form at that time. That was before we had online registration.
Right.
And it was practically, I had to bring the form home, drag them out. And get them.
Yes. How can voters check to see whether they are registered?
They can go to our website and it says, check my registration and see if they're registered to vote. If they don't think they are, they can call us and we can drill down for
Confirm.
them, because it might be they might enter a different name than they originally registered to vote. Some people register to vote and live in the same place 20, 30 years, and maybe they registered under Reginald instead of something
Reggie,
else,
yeah,
or
right.
Reggie, and we just can do a little bit better search than they can.
If they find that for some reason they're not registered, what can they do?
Well, the voter registration deadline was last night at 9 o'clock. So for this election, they're out, but they can register to vote and they'll be ready for the primary, which is right around the corner.
True.
March 17th.
You got it.
It's coming
Patrick's
up.
Day.
It'll be here
Filing
before we know
deadlines.
it.
Filing deadlines December. Yeah, in December.
Yes.
So yeah,
Yes.
we're getting ready for that.
We're not going to get much rest. We likely will put out an online guide for the primary.
Good.
We don't usually do a printed one, but we will
Nice.
likely do an online one. The guide is also available at the League website, lwvdayton.org.
David, I think there's one other point, issue I'd like for Jan to explain to the audience, and that is areas of Trotwood,
Thank
Dayton,
you.
and
I was gonna
Harrison.
go there, too.
Oh, you're going to go? Okay.
No, go ahead. I mean,
Because many of them will be out of their homes for at least another year or two.
maybe.
And it's my understanding they will be allowed to vote at their current address up to,
Tom, that's right. Anybody that was affected by the tornado, and there were 2 locations that were wiped out that we can't use as a polling location anymore. And let me see if I can find them here. Well, they are on our website. We have an icon called
Sure.
Tornado, and they will be getting notifications from us. However, if they're not at their home, they have a forwardable address where the rest of their mail is going, it will be forwarded to their
Okay.
new residence. So if they're staying, say, at an aunt or an uncle's place or a temporary housing facility, they still can vote at their old polling locations if they have, and this is the turnkey, the intent to return to that home
Okay.
and that residential address.
I see.
So they don't lose their right to vote in their polling location. If they have the intent to return, if they're waiting on a roof, if they're waiting, dry out mold, whatever, needs to be fixed in that home to make it habitable again.
Right. So even though they may be living with an aunt or an uncle,
Right.
a friend or a family member,
Right.
their intent to return to that, and many of those are Trotwood addresses, although I
Right.
think there's some Beaver Creek addresses in Greene
Yeah.
County that
Yeah,
were
Yeah, and
also
that's in
affected.
Greene County, right.
Would Greene County be the same, Jan? Can you speak for that? or
I
can you-
can't speak for Greene County, but as far as intent to return, I can speak for
Okay.
Greene County. That's a state law, and that's statewide.
Okay.
and I don't think
Yes.
that, I don't know that there's a time period, but I'm just simply saying, in a reasonable, maybe up to 5, 6 years maybe, but I think, as Jan pointed, from my understanding, as long as they intend to return, then they should be able to vote in that precinct. Now, that precinct may not be there, so that's why there are other spots. And we'll be working with some of the residents, Trotwood and Harrison, to help them get to the NAACP.
I was going to say, so the
be-
churches or the NAACP?
We'll be helping
yeah.
them to get to those spots. But it's so easy to do early voting, that's another, or absentee voting, that's another option for for the residents for the immediate
Absolutely.
time being.
And of course, the county building's open. I was there
Right,
today.
right, the
I
county
know that we
building's
can
open.
walk, at least for me at St. Clair, I can walk across the street and
Right.
I can
Whoa.
submit that.
What about the parking for those of us who have to drive there?
Parking is free, as it always has been since we've had early voting at the Board of Elections, and you just come in, vote, and we'll give you a sticker for your parking ticket.
Okay, and what about accessibility for people who might have trouble with stairs or,
The building is ADA accessible,
great,
and we have to be under law.
Right.
yes.
And so I rode the escalator down,
Right,
but
right.
I know the elevator is also available for a person in a wheelchair. But that
Correct.
question about accessibility is important, and you mentioned earlier that these new machines are adaptable, and I wanted to ask you more about what that meant.
Yeah.
I presume I know, but maybe I don't. Is that for sight, a person that might be limited by sight, that they can maybe make the screen large enough they can see it? or-
Right, there are some modifications that one can make on the screen for contrast, for large type size.
Okay.
And then the ADA provisions for maybe a sip and puff device or something else that handicapped community or the disabled
Sure.
community can bring in to use. They can plug in themselves or use our headset for audio.
Okay.
And this was the first year I didn't have to record the ballot, which was great, because usually I have to record the entire ballot for the audio, so we had a
Okay.
digital recorder this year as part of that
So now,
package.
what's this computer's name? Alexa
Yeah.
or something is gonna,
Alexa will
yeah,
tell
gonna-
you
gonna read you
who your candidates are.
That's cute. But I appreciate that, and I think that what we're trying to make sure is that everybody has the opportunity
Right.
to vote, and that includes anybody that is differently abled,
Right.
anybody that might have been displaced because of the tornado,
Right.
anybody that, for whatever reason, right, is concerned about it, then there's opportunities for them to pursue. The League of Women Voter Guide is a great resource because it's got
indeed.
many of the questions answered that you might have right inside the first page, right?
Right.
You see it?
Yes, all the election information is right there on page 2. Oh, on page 4, there's a short explanation about write-in candidates.
Oh, okay.
But Jan, how will these new machines handle write-ins?
The new machines are great with write-ins. That was always a kind of a lot of work for Board of Elections officials to tally them. The first thing is we have to determine whether or not that the write-in candidate is a valid write-in candidate. To be a valid write-in candidate, you still have to file a petition with the Board of Elections. A lot of people will write nonsense in the write-in candidates' names like Mickey Mouse or crazy stuff like that that just doesn't make sense. And it muddies the waters, for us when we're counting their write-in candidates. But our high-speed scanners, we have it's called an model 850 high-speed scanner, but it has a reservoir for our write-in candidates, and we'll be able to count those much easier than we used to be able to. Yeah, they'll read it and count it, and then we'll know if it's a valid candidate or not.
So to vote for a write-in candidate, a voter needs to know when he goes to the polls the name of that candidate.
Right, because it's not
And the
on the
spelling.
ballot.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's not on the ballot. So
Yes.
each polling location will have a list of the write-in candidates, if there are write-in candidates at that polling location, and they have to, they'll ask to see it.
Yes, and the names of write-in candidates are listed in the races in the voter's guide. When we have contact information early enough, we do send questionnaires to write-in candidates in contested races. This year, there were no write-in candidates in contested races in Montgomery County, I don't think.
I don't think there were
Greene
either.
County does have several races with contested races with write-in candidates, and unfortunately, we did not receive information about those in time to send out questionnaires to those candidates. However, their names are all listed, and so voters in Greene County can pursue more information about candidates for those races. But they do need to know those names when they go to the polls.
Sure,
That might be a reason to take your voter's guide with you.
absolutely. Good. Thank you. You, again, are just a wealth of knowledge. I appreciate that. We've got just a couple minutes left, and we kind of started by talking about how do we manage voter apathy in this midterm election? And I'm wondering if there's any inspiring words, Tom, that you can offer, if there's maybe any historic perspective that you could draw upon to think about.
Maybe not historical, but just a bit that, democracy means citizen rule. And our democracy works best when people are eligible to vote and they engaged in the voting process. So I always encourage people to exercise your rights as a person in this democracy. And voting is one of those duties, responsibilities, and opportunities. So for me, I would encourage some people to vote in this election and every election.
Thank you. Any other thoughts as we wrap things up?
Jim, we've heard a lot over the last year or two about restoring voting rights to felons. What's the status in Ohio?
Well, currently, if you're a convicted felon, you cannot vote, and there is some movement. I sit on the, what? You're looking at me like that's new.
My understanding was that you can vote as long as you're not incarcerated.
Right, as long as you're not incarcerated, correct.
Yes.
I'm sorry. I left that part out. Yes.
That's a very important part
Yeah, right.
because in many, in some states,
Florida
Right,
being
you
one.
right.
can't vote.
Yeah, and that hasn't changed.
Yes.
Yes.
So in Ohio, as long as you are not serving a sentence in jail,
Right,
you can vote even if you have a felony conviction,
right,
even if you're on parole
right,
or on probation
Right.
or house arrest.
right.
Yes, or in jail, but before you have been convicted,
Well,
awaiting
because
trial.
you're innocent until proven guilty.
Sure.
Yes.
That's the cornerstone of our
Okay.
democracy.
Yes.
But
People
you
forget
have to you have to register again to vote once your term of incarceration is over. You have to then register. So that's what you have to do next.
And so then we have to think about the implication of that, because that means you need to have a permanent residence, right? And so there are some challenges for
Right.
people that were formerly
Yes.
incarcerated in order to gain those access. So I appreciate your concern because, of course, these are citizens, and in many ways, their experience may be able to help us to make better choices as we move forward as a community, too. They certainly understand the world in a way that I don't. Because of the nature of my experiences being very different from theirs. So I appreciate that, and I think we ought to just remind people one more time about the importance of the voter guide. It is available. It's a nonpartisan resource available to us, and we can find it at, right, the libraries. We're going to have a number of them available at St. Clair, but also they'll be printed, or they'll be included in the distribution of the Dayton Daily News.
Yes, and the Xenia Gazette.
Okay.
And the suburban papers in Greene County, and I believe with the Brookville Star this year. And they'll also be available in many churches. We've had people volunteer to take them to churches, to restaurants, to businesses, and they are available at the league office.
Right.
You can pick some up and take them to any place you think there will be people who would like them. And always, you can find it at the league website, lwvdayton.org.
Appreciate that. Yeah.
Great.
Any other last thoughts? Jen, any other recommendations, suggestions for our voting public?
Or just come on out and vote. We'd love to see you on Election Day.
Absolutely. And those dates and times are in the voter guide,
Yes.
so people can find that conveniently. Any other thoughts? I'm
None for
going to
me.
wrap
David,
things
wanna
up.
wrap?
Well, good. We want to thank our guests, Tom, Jan, and Lucianne, for their great discussion tonight on the 2019 election. And we thank you, the viewing audience, for watching. The League of Women Voters Empowering You series is really what the League is doing to encourage everyone to be a voter, and not just vote once, but to be a voter every time by participating in the upcoming election. If you have any further questions about this or an upcoming program that you want to discuss, please contact the League by emailing league@lwvdayton.org or by calling our office at 937-228-4041. Have a great evening and good night.